Yeah.
Simulcasting is finally available on Twitch. Just stream as usual and simulcast your stream on Kick. It's like working two jobs at the same time. So don't just limit your stream.
With DataCamp, you don't need to download Python to learn Python. You can learn right in your browser with hands-on exercises for coding and data analysis, all in a way that makes data kind of fun.
Of jobs being created, the amount of money that you can make. This is on the upside. But on the downside, there is a huge amount of competition. There's an enormous amount of engineers who are in the market. And of course, there's the threat of AI replacing everyone. And you feel like it's like a switch that can happen down the line at any moment. And it's a very interesting combination of those two forces that are happening right now. And you're in the middle of all of this and you're trying to figure out how can you win. What you need to understand is that there is a narrow window of opportunity where AI is going to create more jobs before it starts replacing them. And that's because we are at the start of the AI revolution. At the start of any revolution, this is when people build generational wealth. Think about the internet revolution, think about crypto, and think about the fact that AI is going to be bigger than all of them combined. Right now, what I believe is that we're still early on the bell curve. We are at the spot where more money is available, more jobs being created, people are earning a lot more. It's the most exciting time to be in. And this is what we're seeing. Look at the number of startups that have been created over just the past 3 months. Look at the number of jobs that have been opened in all the startups, right? Whenever a new company is created, it's new jobs that are being added to the market. Look at the amount of money that has been invested in AI startups. We're talking about billions of dollars in those companies. Incubators like YC and different startup incubators, they're all recruiting AI startups to join their cohorts. It's a very, very exciting time to be in. And naturally, it leads to a higher amount of jobs. It leads to a higher amount of money being poured in. It leads to those jobs being very highly paid because companies, they want to hire as big as possible. They want to attract the best talent. They want to give them all the conditions possible in order for them to win, right? Because companies, they're all competing to get a bigger size of the pie. And it's this very interesting.
Ladies, look at me. Now look at your man. Now look back at me. Now look.
Love to suck Britain's dick. I honestly had completely forgotten what Tony Blankley sounded.
Yeah.
I mean, what?
Oh yeah, you're off mic, bro.
Adam just leaves the show and then wants to scream from across.
I had a peeves. Yeah, he sounded like a Boston guy.
It doesn't sound like a boss.
Piss on this dick. Tony Blankley? That's the second time you said piss on this dick to me.
Yeah, the first time you pissed already at the beginning of the show.
I know. I've been urinating a lot.
What's
I'm on
up,
a
dude?
bender right now.
I love to go pee-pee.
I love pissing in a woman's pussy.
You know, I have fun with that McLaughlin group shit, but nobody's going to get it.
Yeah, but it doesn't
nobody
matter.
knows.
It's still funny.
Nobody watched the McLaughlin.
I think you and I were probably the only people our age.
Yeah,
to
but
watch
an
that.
old guy, dude. The joke of just an old guy trying to get the other old bitch on his panel
Yeah,
show
Simon
to
watched
fuck
it.
him
Yeah.
is so funny.
That show was literally
Whatever, I don't give a shit.
That show was,
Tony dead? Or just one less guy for Eleanor to fuck? He was my friend too, John.
I've been on.
Oh
most
yeah,
of
he
these
was your
shows.
friend, huh? Yeah, well, I've heard about your fucking friends. We all know about Eleanor's big old Rolodex of friends. Guys she calls up to hang out 8, 9 o'clock at night. Who gives a shit? I don't care. She certainly doesn't. Jesus Christ, she's got a pussy like the fucking revolving door at Macy's. Takes up half a block. It's filled with a bunch of tatted balloons. Like a parade of clowns got trapped in it. Let's use condoms, Eleanor.
Okay.
You really food inspector?
As far as you know, yeah.
Then inspect this!
Dad.
That shoots.
an existing variable based on its previous value. Now I will delete all of that for the moment, but these are a couple of shorthand notations that are worth keeping in mind. You will also encounter them again later in the course. Mathematical operations aren't everything though. We can also work with strings, so with text in our JavaScript code. And I want to show this as well. Here I'm logging a value again, but now I'll log the result of adding two strings together. Let's say Max and then Schwarzmuller, which is my last name. Now here I'm using the plus operator. But I'm not using it on numbers as I did it before, but instead on strings. And that will work. If I save this, you see this as a result. The strings have been concatenated. That's how we call this. You can use the plus operator on strings to combine them into one string. Now here we don't have any blank or white space between these two words that have been combined because we didn't add any here in this operation. If we would want one, we would have to add one like this maybe. And that's how we then would get a blank in that final string as well. So you can use the plus operator on strings as well to concatenate those strings. You can't, however, use the minus operator. So maybe you would think that this could work and it should maybe return M as a result, but that is actually not what will happen. Instead, we get NaN as a result, and that's now not a special text, but instead this is a special type built into JavaScript, which means not a number. And you get this type whenever you perform a mathematical operation on values where JavaScript then is not able to yield a number as a result. And in case of the plus operator, there is an exception. This is allowed to work on strings, but for minus, the times operator, the division operator, and the modulus operator, all these operators can really only be used on numbers and not on strings. But concatenating strings is a common task and therefore something you should know. And again, just as before, here I'm doing it in that place. I am not using any variables. Of course, we could store these individual strings in variables and then combine these variables, or also store the result of this in a variable and then use that variable. I'm just not doing that here because I'm not using these values or the result of this concatenation anywhere else in this code.
Operators and value types some have actually take as our data reach the end of that section. There's some more useful information about operator values and value types. You also find it attached as a PDF. More on operators. In the previous lecture, we explored key operators that you will use all the time. Mia! Hello, Mia. previous lecture, we explored key operators that math with JavaScript.
Now there is one
Yeah, I'll actually go through this. Okay, another plant species that is particularly common in the Fall Creek region of Skyrim is thistle, this purple flower brush guys in the wet temperate pine forest. Thistle is a key ingredient for several potions. The most common being resist frost. Thistle and snowberries provide an extremely cheap resist frost recipe, great for the northern region of Skyrim. If you are enjoying the forest, onto this. More operators. In the previous lecture, we explored key operators that you use all the time when doing math with JavaScript, which, as it turns out, is also something you do all the time. Add, subtract. There also are useful shorthand operators that we haven't explored in the video, but which will also be shown later in the course. Export. Switch. This doesn't make sense. Oh, okay. Shorthand notation for variable equals the variable plus 2 increases the value stored in a variable and store it back. Okay. So it's written like this. And what it does is stores the variable back in itself. It's a variable plus 2 and then it stores it back. Okay, I get it now. The same thing here. Multiply, divided. Yeah, I get it. More value types. It is also important to understand and keep in mind that all values have certain value types. 2 is a number, whereas high or strings. It is also important to understand and keep in mind that all values have certain value types. 2 is a number, pi are strings, especially the case is important. It looks like a number to us humans, And of course, it technically is a number, but it's stored as a text, not as a raw number. Why does that matter? It matters once you start performing operations with the operators mentioned above. Here are some example code snippets and the results that would be produced by them. You can test them all in the JavaScript console in the developer tool of the browser. If you go through the above examples, there might be some code lines that you maybe didn't expect to produce the results they do produce, especially E, F, and G, can be confusing. I'm going to leave this for later and go through this module.
Last characteristic about strings which I want to show to you, which is related to arrays actually. Let's say we have a certain user name, Max here in this case, and now we want to find out how long that name is. As a human, we can count it, but we don't always want to count because it's error prone. And in a running application, in a running website, that variable value might actually not be hard coded into this code as it's currently, but instead we might be fetching this from some input field on the page. And that is actually something we will be doing in this demo I showed. Now there is one last characteristic about strings which I want to show to you, which is related to arrays actually. Let's say we have a certain user name, Max here in this case, and now we want to find out how long that name is. As a human, we can count it, but we don't always want to count because it's error prone. And in a running application, in a running website, that variable value might actually not be hard. Coded into this code as it's currently, but instead we might be fetching this from some input field on the page. And that is actually something we will be doing in this demo I showed you earlier, which we are going to build in the next course section. Because in this demo, we need to count the length of the user input, which of course changes with every keystroke and which we as a developer therefore don't know in advance. And in situations like this, we need a way of finding out how long some text is. So it's not something we need here for this example, this hard-coded string, which means a value we define as a developer, which never changes, which does not depend on some input of the website visitor. Here it is just hard-coded and therefore we could count it manually, but let's assume we're getting this from some dynamic input and we don't know the length in advance. In such cases, we might want to derive the length programmatically, and that is thankfully easy to do in JavaScript. We can just use the string that we want to count, or the variable that holds the string, which I have in this case, and then use the dot notation to access dot length. And that's really important and maybe also confusing. A string is not an object, and yet we can use the dot notation on a string to access various methods, since we have this purple kind of box here, on that string. And we also have this length property in addition to all these methods. Now, this is simply something that's built into JavaScript. You could say that all the strings you are creating are automatically wrapped with an invisible object behind the scenes by JavaScript, so that you have certain properties that you can access on your strings. So they kind of are converted into objects behind the scenes. And we have this behavior so that we have certain functionalities or utilities that we can access on these strings. like for example dot length to get the length of this string, the number of characters that make up this string. And if I save this, then I get 3 here as a result, which of course is the length of this max string. And as you can see, if I again add a dot here and I get this suggestion pop-up, there is way more than just length. And you see we have a bunch of methods here which we can access on our string, and that length property which we saw, and definitely feel free to play around with them. For example, there is the toUpperCase method, and since it's a method, we need to execute it by adding these parentheses here. And if I call that, then I get this string converted to all uppercase characters. So these are utility functionalities which can come in handy from time to time. Now, that length property is also interesting because it does not just exist on strings, but also on arrays. Let's say we have an array, either created just in time like this when we need it, or stored in a variable like hobbies. And then here I'll have sports and cooking. And if I now use this array and I add a dot on this, then I also get a bunch of methods and properties there as well, including this length property. And this length property then will tell us how many items are in this array. So in this case, for hobbies, we have 2 elements in there, and hence if I save this, I get 2 as a result, since I have 2 items in that array. And of course, there's kind of a relation between length on a string and length on an array. You could say that a string is a bit like an array. It's technically not exactly the same, but a string, of course, is a collection of characters. An array is a collection of any kind of values. That's why we have length on both. Now on our array, if I again add a dot, now on our array, if I kind of values, that's why we have length on both. Now on our array, an array is a collection of any kind of values. Okay? It's technically, and of course there's kind of a relation between length on a string and length on an array. You could say that a string is a bit like an array. It's technically not exactly the same, but a string, of course, is a collection of characters. An array is a collection of any kind of values. That's why we have length on both. Now on our array, if I again add a dot after hobbies, we also have many methods here, like push or reduce or sort, but these are a bit more advanced and therefore we will not explore them right now. I just wanted to highlight this length property since it is very useful, we will need it later in the course, and in many programs you are going to write, you probably will also have some scenarios where you want to count characters or elements in an array, and that's why length can be useful. And that's it for these operations and values and what you can do with them for the moment. You will see a lot of these operations and a lot of these properties and so on being used throughout this course, and that's why I wanted to give you a summary and an overview of these important operations here.
Splitting JavaScript code across multiple files. In this module and also the next module, we also work on one JS file only, and we only include link one JS file at the same time to our HTML file. That's not a must do though. If you build more complex websites, that might require different scripts that do different things. You can absolutely include multiple separate script files into one and the same HTML file. You can simply add multiple elements into your HTML file. The linked scripts will be parsed and executed in the order you define in the HTML file. It also doesn't matter whether you link them in your head section or your body section, or if you do both as shown in this example. You can also define functions or variables in file A and use them you can also define functions or variables in file A and use them in file B, though you should make sure that the file where you define them included before the file where you use them. So an example above, we could define a variable in the first JS script and then use it in the second JS script. Okay.
Now that's it for this course section. We talked about variables and values, arrays and objects, and functions. Now you might recall that at the beginning of this module, I also mentioned working with the DOM, and I made that super funny joke about Vin Diesel, and that I mentioned control structures. These are topics we'll explore in the next course sections. Because now we did learn about these key fundamentals, which prepare us for these slightly more advanced topics, which working with the DOM and working with control structures are. For the moment, you should know what variables are, and that we have values like numbers or strings or arrays or objects which we can store in variables. That we do use variables so that we can define them in one place and use them in another place, possibly also change them and overwrite them and use them as often as we want. And you learned that we can use variables either for just outputting them with alert or console log or other ways which we'll learn about later, and that we can of course also use them in calculations, like here, a mathematical calculation, deriving a new value which I store in a new variable in this case. And that actually all takes place in a function, which is not a must-do, but which makes sense if you have the same operation which you want to perform in different parts of your code, maybe also with different concrete values. That's possible because functions take parameters, so that you can call them with different values, and they can return values, so that you can also store the result of calling a function in another variable or use it in another part of your code. We also learned that we can add functions to objects, and we then call them methods, just as we call variables inside of an object properties. And that's something which we will also do later, but that for the moment that's mostly a feature which we will use indirectly, like here with console log. Certainly revisit certain lectures of this course section if some of these topics are not entirely clear yet. Maybe have a look at that exercise again and try redoing it if something's not clear yet, because these are important fundamentals, which we'll now use to build up on in the next course sections.
JavaScript is a key programming language as a developer, and even though we haven't worked too much useful or realistic code yet, we did have a thorough first look at the most important basics, and it's time to check your knowledge. What does JavaScript do? What HTML and CSS can't do? Interactive behavior. How is JavaScript code added to a web page? Via the script element, either by adding code inside of it or by linking to an external code file via the went crazy for a second. What's a value in JavaScript? Values are data containers that receive a certain name and then store numbers or text. The values are data like number strings which you use in operations. Values are data like variables which you use in operations. What are variables? Variables are data containers that can store values so that they can be used multiple times and in other code lines. Yes. Do you need to use variables? No. What's an object in JavaScript? A command that's built into the browser? No. A list of typically related values where every value is stored as a so-called element with an index that starts at 0. A group of typically related values where every value is stored as a so-called property with a name that identifies it and the stored value. Yeah. What's an array? It's the opposite of that one. What? A list of typically related values. That's yeah, I'm bugging. Yeah, I knew this. I just didn't read it. What are functions? Pick the best and most precise definition. Built-in commands, built-in or custom commands that you can use in your code. Built-in or custom commands that you can use in your code to perform clearly defined tasks, possibly multiple times. Which of the below snippets defined creates a function correctly? Which statement about functions is wrong? Functions can be created to define code on demand, code that's not executed immediately, but when the function is called. The function can be created to define code that will typically be executed in a different line of code. Functions can be created to execute code immediately once the browser presses no. What does... Yeah, no. You have to stay there. What does this code snippet do? Calls a function? Yeah. What are function parameters? The input values that may be required by a function. The variables that are passed into a function when a function's called. Ah, the first one. Yeah, I knew that one. What's a function return value? If a function overwrites a value received via a parameter, we call that new value a return value. If a function overwrites a value received via parameter, a function may return a value via the return keyword. This value can be used in the place where the function is called. A function may receive input values, which we also call return values, as they influence which values the function may produce. It has to be that one. What? Oh wow. Do functions have to accept parameters and return values? No. What does JavaScript do that HTML, CSS can't do? Interactivity. How is JavaScript code added to a web page? Script with the source attribute. What's a value in JavaScript? No, Mia. Yo.
In the previous course section, we picked up important basics about JavaScript, about the JavaScript language as a whole. In this course section, we are now going to see why we really need JavaScript, and we'll see its biggest strength in action, that we can interact with the so-called DOM, and you will learn what the DOM actually is in this module, but I can already say that this in the end will be all about using JavaScript to select elements on the page and to manipulate elements on the page. HTML elements that are displayed on the page and their styles, you can use JavaScript to change those. And therefore in this course section, we are going to explore what exactly that DOM thing is, how we can interact with it, and how we can also actually listen to events, like the user clicking somewhere, or the user entering something into an input field, and how we can then leverage JavaScript to reach out to HTML elements that make up our website, and how we can change them with JavaScript so that we can build interactive websites which consist of more than just static HTML and CSS code. And of course, we're not just going to dive into these topics in theory, but you also will see plenty of examples in this module. And in this course section, we will then also be able to build this example which I showed you in the previous course section already. We're going to learn everything we need for that in this section now. Now to get started, I am again back in an empty project, and I'll do what we did many times before, create a new HTML file with a basic skeleton. Here I'll say advanced JavaScript, and I'll add a JavaScript file. I'll name it app.js, which I want to import in my HTML file. And we did learn that this works with help of those script tags, where we can add this source attribute and then import this JavaScript file like this. Now we're ready to write more JavaScript code, and therefore I'll open this site with my live server.
One of the most interesting species of flower in Skyrim is Deathbell, typically found in swampy terrain. This beautiful flower is commonly used in alchemy for creating various poisons. Common stories say Death Bell can grow and lure unsuspecting victims to their eventual doom, although I have yet to find any validation to these tall tales myself.
Again, so that we have this preview, and we will continue working with that console in the developer tools for now, so that I don't use alerts for outputting something, but instead this console. Here, which is a bit less.
What's up, man?
As annoying for us as a developer. And with that, we got the setup we need to dive in and get started. So now with our starting setup out of the way, let's dive right in and let's explore this DOM thing and what it is and how it helps us when it comes to using JavaScript to build interactive websites and to manipulate what we see on the screen. And for that, let me first of all introduce two global variables which are always available in our code, which we can always use. Built-in variables which are provided by the browser to us in our JavaScript code. And that would be the window and the document variables and objects that are actually stored in that variables. These are built-in variables, which then in turn contain built-in functions. And we got this global window object, and we will see how we can use it in just a second, which is a globally available variable that contains an object, which then in turn holds a lot of utility information and functionality related to the active browser window, and browser window here also means browser tab. So if you are running code on your website, you can use the window object to access information about the browser tab that opened your website. Not about other tabs for security reasons, because otherwise your website could extract information from other websites loaded in different tabs. But you can access information about your browser tab. And now to see this in action, in our code, we can access this window object like this. This window variable is globally available even though we never defined it. We can also console log window to look inside of it, to look into it. If I save that console log window, then here in your developer tools in the browser, you see this window object being logged here. And the great thing is that when you console log an object, in that console here, in the DevTools, you can dive into that object and have a look at all the properties and methods that might exist in this object, simply by clicking on this small arrow here. Now you see, we got lots of properties and methods here. Methods are marked by this F here, by this function symbol, because methods are just functions built into an object, and properties are all the properties without that F symbol. And you see we got lots of properties and functions here, and you should not be intimidated by this. With most of them you will never work, so you don't need to learn them by heart, and you can always console log it and dive into that anyways if you want to. But one thing we can see in there, for example, if I scroll to the very top, is this alert function here, this alert method. And that might sound familiar. We did use this alert function here before in the course. Now, the interesting thing about this window object is that you can access it by its name, like I'm doing it here when I'm logging it, but that everything that's built into this window object is actually also made available by the browser as global variables or functions. So all the methods and all the properties you find in here can also be accessed without window dot. That's a special exception made by the browser for this very important window object. That's why we can execute alert like this, but we could also do window.alert. That would also work, and it would invoke the same function. So these are equivalents, these two lines of code. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because this window object gives us a lot of utility information and methods that we can use to achieve a lot of things. For example, we can find out on which page we currently are, we can access utility functions like alert, and we'll see a couple of these features in action throughout the course. Of course, we did already see alert. But there also is one very specific property on this window object, which is even more useful to us, and which is super important, and which we will use a lot in web development. And that's the document object. So the document property on the window object, which holds yet another object, a so-called nested object, because it's an object inside of another object. And this document object holds information and functionality related to the loaded website content. So not to the tab as a whole, but instead to the actual content that was brought onto the screen. So to our HTML code that was parsed by the browser and that leads to something being displayed on the screen. To this parsed HTML content, to this content we get access with this document object. And this, for example, will give us a lot of functionalities that allow us to reach out to certain HTML elements, add event listeners to certain elements, for example, to react on a click on a certain element by the user, and it will also allow us to manipulate the HTML code and change what's displayed on the screen without fetching a new HTML page. Now we're going to have a look at this document object and what we can do with it in this section, but this document object is related to this DOM concept, which is also extremely important when working with JavaScript. So what is this DOM thing about then? DOM is the abbreviation for Document Object Model. And that's a concept in web development that describes the data representation, the browser internal representation of the parsed HTML code we wrote. So as a web developer, we write HTML code. That's what we did in all those previous sections, basically. And the browser, when it loads this website, then parses this code so that it knows what it should display on the screen. Now, during this parsing process, the browser kind of translates the HTML code into a bunch of JavaScript objects, you could say. Every HTML element we created is translated to a JavaScript object, and those objects are then nested into each other to represent our HTML structure. That's how you can think about it. Technically, it's a bit more advanced than that, but roughly that is what's going on. And since we have this JavaScript representation of our HTML code, so since this HTML structure was translated into a structure of JavaScript objects, our JavaScript code is able to interact with that DOM, as it's called, so with that browser internal representation of the HTML code, and we can extract data from there, for example. Of the HTML value the user entered into an input field, and or manipulated. We can add new elements, change existing elements, for example, change the content or the styling, and do many other things. And the door to this DOM thing is this document object. Through that object, we access this so-called DOM, so this browser internal representation of our HTML code. Now, why will this DOM thing and this document object matter to us? Because if we want to build a feature for our website, like this character counter, where we can see how many characters are left before we hit the max length, and where we change the styling of these elements when we go below 10 remaining characters. If we want to build something like this, then we'll need that DOM. Because in our code, which you can't understand at this point, but we'll get there throughout the course, in our code we will, for example, use this document object to get access to certain elements in our HTML code, so to certain elements on this page, like this input field, to then listen to certain events, extract, for example, the current input value, to then count the number of characters that are currently entered, and to then change the styling or add extra classes. And again, we will learn how exactly that works and what all that code does step by step throughout this module. But that's why this DOM thing will matter to us. We need a way of getting access to the parsed HTML code in the browser so that we can change it or that we can extract values from it, like, for example, the entered input. That's why we need the DOM, because our JavaScript code needs access to what's happening on the screen. And that's what we're going to explore over the next lectures, and then this will also become clearer. So this document object, this document property on the window object, which holds an object itself, is our bridge to this DOM. And to see this not just on these slides, but also in action, I added some HTML code here to this index.html file. And that's essentially that code I showed you on this slide before. I added this content to my HTML file, and you can add it yourself. Attached, you also find my index.html file so that you can download it and replace yours with it if you want to be sure that you're using the same code. And now we can play around with that code and with JavaScript to tap into that DOM, into this JavaScript object representation of the parsed HTML code. And for that, we don't want to access the window object as a whole, but instead this document property, which we got on that window. Object. This gives us access to this DOM, as I mentioned. Now, I also did mention that the entire window object, or all the properties and methods of that window object, are automatically made available globally as variables and functions, which is why we can access alert like this instead of writing window.alert, which we also can do, but of course that's shorter. And because that's the case, I of course don't have to write window.document, I can just write document to access this document property on the window object. And if I do that and save this globally with window object, or all the properties and methods of that window object are automatically made available globally as variables and functions, which is why we can access alert like this instead of writing window.alert, which we also can do, but of course that's shorter. And because that's the case, I of course don't have to write window.document, I can just write document to access this document property on the window object. And if I do that and save this app.js file in my browser, I see this dummy content which I added, which is not too important right now and which has no styling. But in this console, in the DevTools, I see this document thing. And as an extra nice feature here in Chrome in the DevTools, when I hover over this document object, which is being output to the console, you see that the page on the left gets highlighted. Because this document kind of represents this entire rendered, displayed HTML code, as I mentioned. Now we can still expand this object because it still is a regular JavaScript object, just fulfilling a certain special purpose, so to say. And if I expand it, I get this. I see my HTML code here, which is just a certain way of displaying this in Chrome. And that can be confusing because that does not look like JavaScript code at all. Instead, that looks like regular HTML code, which at least proves my point that this document object is our bridge to this DOM thing here. But this also is confusing, because I want to clarify that inside of this document thing here, we don't have HTML code. Instead, we have what I showed on this slide. We have an object with more properties and values. And to see this real object, we can use console.dir instead of console.log, which is simply a different way of outputting this to the console, and it is a way that will output the true object that is stored in this document thing, instead of giving us this special way of displaying. This object which Chrome has built in. And when using console.dir instead of console.log, if I now expand this, I see the real JavaScript object, because it is a standard JavaScript object in the end. And we see a bunch of properties in there, and we'll also find some methods in there. And we're going to work with a couple of properties and methods throughout this section and throughout this course. Now, most interesting right now are two properties which we find in there. If we search for age, we find this head property. And if I expand that, we basically find all the information the browser stored about our head section here, which is affecting this page. And for example, if I scroll down a bit, I find this children key here. And if I expand this, I find all the different head elements, which I indeed did add here in my head section. 3 meta elements, the title and the script. I find that here as well. Which again proves my point. That's the translation of our HTML code to JavaScript. And that's what the browser uses behind the scenes to know what it should display and how it should display it. But more interesting than this head property with all that stored information is the body property. That holds all the information about the body HTML content and what the browser made of it. And in here, we also find this children property, which holds a list, an array, of all the HTML elements we have in our body. And that's this h1 element and this paragraph, and then also a script which is actually injected by our live server extension, so not written by us. But here we can then expand the paragraph, and we find another nested object here. And you can tell objects and arrays apart by these index numbers. If you have these index numbers, then this here is an array, and if you have other property names, it's an object. And here we have all the data the browser gathered about this paragraph here, including more children, like this anchor element in this case. And you see if I hover on that, it gets highlighted on the left in my page. And that's a lot of useful information which we can access through JavaScript to, for example, extract some value a user might have entered into an input field if we had one. And we can also manipulate that to, for example, change the styles or the CSS classes or the content of certain elements. And that's what we'll do in the next lectures. So let's start playing around with that DOM, and let's see how we can manipulate it from inside JavaScript. Because of course the goal is not to just output this document in the console. And let's maybe start with this link. This link in our HTML code has no actual address. It just has this hash placeholder as an address. And hence if I click this link, it leads nowhere. Now let's say we want to write some JavaScript code that changes this address. And of course, that's still a bit of a redundant example, because we could, of course, just set an address here in the HTML code. But we are learning these basics step by step here, and therefore for the moment, we'll practice doing this with JavaScript, so that later we can do more useful and realistic things with JavaScript. So therefore, to set this link address, we will need to get access to this link element. And we saw in the last lecture that this link element is actually inside of this paragraph. So there in the children a property, we have this list of nested HTML elements. So this link here in this case. Since that is the only nested HTML.
sure I went from. Children. Links.
HTML element in the paragraph. And on this anchor element here, we then have various properties that describe this anchor element to the browser. And for example, in there, we find this ref property. And it actually does hold some value here, but this value, if I hover over it so that we can see the entire value, is just our local development server, and there the index.html file hash nothing. So it is basically leading nowhere. And we could now try to change this through JavaScript and see if that maybe makes that link do more than it did before. And therefore, we now need to get access to this ref attribute in this anchor element, which is in the children property.
I think I get it now. I get it now. It's just constantly just children, 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 children. Alright. The link. Is the child of the paragraph. The child of the body is the child of HTML. I get it now. Wow.
Of the paragraph element, which in turn is part of this children array of the body property, which is part of the document. Okay, so that will be some drilling which we have to do. And this will become easier later, but for the moment, let's really do it the hard way, and let's drill into this object. So let's start with the document. And then there we want to access the body. Since document is an object, we can do this with the dot notation and access body. Now body is another object, as we saw. And it is an object which now has this children property. Children, then, as we saw here, is actually
Damn.
in our body here holding an array, as we can tell by these number indexes here. So now we're interested in the paragraph, and we see that this is the second element with index 1. So to access this, I actually even see the code here. If I hover over this one, we have to access children square brackets 1. Since I'm want to access this second element here in this children property of my body. So that's now the paragraph. The paragraph, as we saw, now also has a children property, which holds another array, an array with exactly one element, this anchor element, which is the element I ultimately want to get access to. So again, here we see the code for drilling into this, so I can do children 0 here to access the first element of this element, which is the paragraph. So children 1 on the body is the paragraph, children 0 on that paragraph then is the anchor element. Just what we see here if I hover over this. And then this anchor element, as we saw, has this ref, this href property, which holds the target destination of this link. So if I now access .href here, and here I'm not getting auto-completion anymore for this. As you can see, it's not suggesting href because Visual Studio Code doesn't know that the first element in the second element of body will be an anchor element. It could be any HTML element, or maybe not even exist if this element wouldn't have any children. That's why we're not getting auto suggestions here, but we know that this will exist, and that this will be an anchor element, and that it therefore will have that href property, because we had a look at this output here in the console. So now here we got hold of this href element, and now we want to assign a new value for this link. And how do we assign values in JavaScript? With an equal sign. You could think that we maybe use a colon, because I mentioned that for assigning values to properties, we do use a colon instead of an equal sign, but that's only the case if we are creating an object with these curly braces. So if I create a new object here with the curly braces, and I then have some property, then here I use the colon for assigning some value. That is the case here. But if we drill into a property of an already existing object with the dot notation, then we actually assign a value with an equal sign, just as we do it on a regular variable. And here, this new value should now be a string, because this link here is a string, it's some text, as you can tell by these quotes here as well. And we could, for example, target google.com. So https://google.com. And then add a semicolon. And that's now a very lengthy way of doing that. We will also soon learn about quicker ways of doing that, but it is important to understand how the DOM in general is structured and how you can generally interact with it. So now if I save that, and we then reload this page, I get an error. Cannot read property children of null. And that's a weird error here. I mean, after all, we carefully checked that these properties exist and that we are accessing the right children. So why am I getting this error? Did we do something wrong here? Well, no, we didn't. The reason for this error is basically impossible to find unless you know how JavaScript works and how it's being executed. We wrote this beautiful code here, and yet it fails. And the reason for it failing is that actually our JavaScript code here executes too early. We actually load our JavaScript code here in the head section, and it's important to understand that the browser goes ahead and executes this loaded code right away when this line of code is parsed. And this line of code is actually parsed before this code is parsed. So our JavaScript code executes before the browser even parsed these HTML elements and created the DOM representation for them. Hence, if we try to drill into the DOM here and we try to access different elements, they don't exist yet. Now, you might remember that we were able to console log or dir document though, and we were able to drill into it there in this JavaScript console earlier. And that only works because the document exists right from the start, which is why we can log it immediately, and the content of it, which is missing initially, is basically added to this document object after we initially logged it. So what we're outputting in the console is updated behind the scenes, which can be confusing, but is how it works. So that's why we can log it, but not change it, because when we change it, that happens instantly. It's not waiting until maybe the content is there. So how can we work around that? There are two ways of working around that. We can take our script and not load it here in the head, but instead cut it and move it to the end of the body section here. Then we ensure that this script is only parsed and executed once all this content is here. So if I now save that, you see if I reload, the error is gone. Now we'll see if it worked in a second, but that's one way of fixing the error. The other, more elegant and recommended way is that you leave it here in head and you add another attribute to this. Script element. And that would be the defer attribute. This is a so-called Boolean attribute, which you just have to add like this. You don't have to set a value. Just adding it like this already activates it. And defer tells the browser that it should defer the script execution, that it should wait with the script execution until the entire document has been parsed. So if we add defer here, it also works, and we also get no error. And now let's see if our code in the script actually works. If it does, if I click the link, I should now be redirected to Google. And indeed, if I click it, I am. If I inspect my link here, I also see that this link address shows up here. And
fuck!
And clearly I did not add link address here. I also see to Google. And indeed, if I click it, I am. If I inspect my link here, I also see that this link address shows up here. And clearly I did not add it here in my HTML code. So since it does show up here, and since the link does work as intended, that has to be the result of our JavaScript code. And that's a first example of how we can interact with the DOM to manipulate the page. Not too useful and still a bit clunky, but a first important step. Now let's dig deeper and let's see how we can do this in a more elegant way and how we then can also do more useful things with that. At this point, you should have a rough first understanding of what this DOM thing is, and we did now dig a bit into our DOM, into our JavaScript representation of this HTML code to change this link here, the address of this link. Now, as explained, this DOM thing with which we can interact in JavaScript is basically the translation of our HTML code. And there is one important characteristic about this HTML code, which is also true about this DOM representation. In HTML, as we can see here on the left on this slide, we typically have nested elements. We have this nested structure where the anchor element is a child element of the paragraph, because it's inside the paragraph, and the paragraph is a child element of the body. And for example, the h1 element is also a child of the body, but a sibling to the paragraph, because it's on the same level. We did explore this way earlier in the course, and it is an important characteristic of HTML, this nesting. And with the DOM we have the same. You can think of the DOM as a tree, a nested tree of JavaScript objects. We have the document, which has a body property, which holds yet another object, which has the h1 and the p element as children, and the p element is another object, which has the anchor element as its only child. And that's why we have this kind of code here, where we drill into those nested objects, digging deeper and deeper into different objects. And that is what we saw before in the console as well, when we logged, or dirt, the document. There we could also dive deeper and deeper into this object, if you remember that. Now, I am emphasizing this because it is an important characteristic, and it's important to be aware of that when it comes to looking for a certain HTML element in that DOM object because you want to change it or anything like that. Because it is a very common task that you want to reach out to a certain element in your DOM and you want to change it, like we did it here for this link, where we set a new address. That's one way of changing it. You could also change the content of an element and change the text that's displayed on the screen, or even add a brand new HTML element, or how we also plan to do it in this example which I showed you earlier. There we will need to find a way of selecting this input element to find out what the user entered, and we will need a way of selecting this element here, where we output the number of remaining characters, so that we can update this with every keystroke by the user. We will need a way of getting access to our input element and to this span here, which contains the remaining characters, because that will be data which we need to update on the running website through JavaScript. So selecting elements is a very common task, because you want to extract data or update data. And there are two general approaches which we can look at when it comes to accessing HTML elements in the DOM. Two approaches which we can also combine. You can either drill into the DOM and drill into elements, as I like to call it, which means you use this dot notation for digging deeper and deeper. So what we did here, we drilled into the different levels of HTML elements here. Or you use some utility functions that are provided by the browser to you to query for specific elements with certain commands. So when you drill, you have code like this. And first child, which you see here on this slide, is a property we haven't used before, but we will see it in action over the next minutes. And when you do drill into your DOM like this, then you always have to know the exact structure. You have to know that you want the first child of another child, because that will then be your link. So here in this example, we basically know that this code here will select the anchor element in the paragraph, because we had a look at the console output and clicked our way through to that anchor element there. And of course, we can also infer how we need to drill into this if we have a look at our HTML code. We know that for body, the paragraph is the second element in there, the first one is h1, and that anchor is then the first element in paragraph. The text here doesn't count. But you have to know this kind of structure in order to effectively drill into your DOM and find a certain element so that you can then interact with it. The alternative approach, which often is easier, is that you instead don't remember this exact structure, but you use the utility methods JavaScript and the browser gives you to search for certain elements. For example, by ID or by any CSS selector. So by tag, by class, by ID, as you learned it for CSS in this course. And we're going to see these utility query methods here in action over the next minutes as well. The advantage here is that you don't need to know the exact structure of your DOM and your HTML code. It's enough to know that there is some element with a certain ID or with a certain class, and you can then tell the browser to give you access to that specific element in JavaScript without describing the entire path to that element, as you would need to know it if you drill into the DOM to select a specific element. And these are basically your two main ways of traversing this DOM tree and of selecting specific elements. And because it's so important to understand this, we're now going to practice that. Now, to practice this, I'm here in my console in the DevTools on the loaded web page. Because now I'm not going to write code here in app.js, but instead, the great thing about this console is that we can also write code here. If you click into this field down here, you can write JavaScript code here as well. And we can then instantly run this code by just hitting the Enter key. And that will allow us to play around with JavaScript in an easier way than if we have to write the code, save it, and then see the result here. And now let's say we want to select this h1 element here. Now, when we want to drill into the DOM, we can do this with document body, as we did it before. And then, for example, with children, and you see we get auto-completion here in this console as well. Children, and now I even get a preview here. This is not the final output, I get a preview here of what's inside children. We get an array with 3 elements. The script was not added by us, as mentioned before. It's injected by this live server extension. But we have our h1 and our p element. And if we want to select the h1 element, we can easily see it here in this preview that we need to select the first child. And if you now hit enter, that's being output here. By default, it's output like this, not in this object form, but in this HTML form, which isn't really JavaScript, but a little utility functionality by the Chrome DevTools, where it outputs it like this. If you want to see it differently, then you can console dir, and then put your code in here, so that you console dir this result instead of logging it, which would...
I don't know why that's so funny.
Be the default if you hit enter. If you hit enter here with console dir, then we get the real object being output here. So that's one way of selecting this h1 element. And I'm going to clear this console here with this button, and then I'll show you an alternative way. Because an alternative way would be to access the body and then first child. Except for the fact that now we see the first child is actually some text as it seems, not the h1 element. If you use document body first element child, on the other hand, you get this h1 element. And that's another way of drilling into the DOM. But why are we getting text here if we use first child? Because for that it's important to understand that in our DOM here, we don't just have all these HTML elements, but the text which we have in our HTML document also is of course saved and understood by the browser. Now when we access children, as we did it before, this children property, that will only include child elements, child HTML elements and their DOM representation. But, as I mentioned, that's not all the information the browser saves. It also saves all your text that is part of your HTML document. So all the non-HTML element content. And you see that if you use child nodes instead of children. A node is basically either text or an HTML element. And your entire content, your HTML content, is translated to these nodes. So to these objects with information about your content. Up to this point, we always had a look at HTML elements and their objects, and these are the most important nodes. But all the text content is also saved as such nodes. And we can see that with child nodes or with first child, which actually accesses the first child node, not the first element child. That's what we use first element child instead for. And that can be confusing, but it's only important to remember that your HTML content does not just consist of HTML elements, but of course also as text, and those text pieces are also stored in the DOM. And with the nodes, with child nodes, you get access to both. With children, you just get access to the HTML elements that are stored. And with first child, you actually access the first child node, so to say. The name is just a bit confusing here. Now, it could still be confusing that first child is actually text and not the h1 element, because the first child element of body is not text, but h1. It would be different if we had hi there, here. Then we could argue that the first child element of body is text and not a h1 element. But that's not what we did have. But keep in mind that we have all this white space here. And this white space is not displayed on the screen, but it's technically part of our HTML content. And that is this first child text node here. This first child text node here is actually this empty text We can see this here. This data thing here, which looks a bit weird, is a lot of white space, and this /n thing here just means line break. So it's a line break and then a bunch of white space, and that's exactly what we have here inside of body. A line break into this line 11, and then a bunch of white space. And that's actually our first child node in this body object in our DOM. And we have those text nodes in addition to the HTML elements. Now, I will say that this is not too important to keep in mind, because most of the time you will work with the HTML elements. So with the kind of content you find in the children property. But you should have at least heard about text nodes, and that's why I also wanted to mention them here. Okay, so in the last lecture, we had a look at a couple of properties we can use to drill into the DOM, and we talked about text nodes and HTML element nodes. Now let's come back to accessing elements in the DOM. We learned that we can use the first element child to get access to this H1 element, or document body children 0, for example. And of course, on the other hand, if we type document body children 1, we get access to this paragraph. And conveniently, we even get that highlighted here on the left as I'm typing this command. So it's really very convenient to play around with that here in the Chrome DevTools. That all works, and that's great if we then want to change the content of a certain element. This is how we can select it. But of course, as mentioned, when you do dive into your DOM tree, your DOM structure like this, you always have to know the exact DOM structure. And if you ever change it, for example, if we add a new paragraph in here, I'm new, and we wanted to access this second paragraph, which before was the only paragraph, then we have to adjust our code where we drill into the DOM.
Classes?
Because now, all of a sudden, the paragraph is not the second child in body children, but the third one. So that can be a disadvantage if you drill into your DOM like this. And you see here, I'm already getting an error if I go back to my page, because the code we have in app.js did try to access the second element, which previously was the paragraph with the link, and then the first child of that element, which previously was our anchor element. But since I did now insert this new paragraph in front of this second paragraph, the second element, which we're accessing in our body, is now that new paragraph, because that is the second element here. And when I then try to access the first element in there, then this element doesn't exist anymore, because this paragraph has no child element. It has a text node, but no HTML child element. And that's why I'm getting this error here. We're trying to set ref on an element which we did not find, which was undefined, so to say. And that's why using this drilling approach can sometimes be useful, but mostly only if you want to access the direct child or parent element of another element. Instead, it's more common that you use these query functions, these query methods, which are provided to you by the browser. Now, let's comment out this code here, and let's write this again, but let's now use these query functionalities. We know...
Oh, suck me off. Working 2 jobs here. It's not that far.
Know that we want to get access to this anchor element in the end. And one way of doing that would be to give it an ID, external link, for example. The ID text, of course, is up to you. And now we got a function in JavaScript which we can use to get access to that element by ID. It's a function, or to be precise, a method, that exists on the document object. There we have the getElementById method, written like this. And you should make sure you write it correctly. If you add a typo in there, then it won't work. Of course, using autocompletion is your safest bet of avoiding typos. Now, getElementById is a method, hence we execute it like this, and it's a method that wants a parameter. And the parameter should be the ID for which you're looking. So it should be a string, hence we need quotes, and then in there, the ID which we added. On an element, in this case, external link. And then this will look for an element with that ID, and if it finds it, it gives us access to that element. It returns that element. And we learned about return statements and functions before. This essentially is a built-in function, a built-in method that does return this element we're looking for by its ID. So this function will return this element object, in our case here, this anchor element object. And since that's the case, we can add a dot here, because we know that this here returns an object. So now with that dot here, we dive into that returned object and do something with it. Alternatively, we can of course also store this returned object in a variable. And here I'll quickly store it in a variable. Anchor element could be a fitting name. And then we can access anchor element dot something in a new line. That's totally up to you. We can do it in the same line or store it in a variable and then do it in a new line. The latter approach has the advantage of avoiding overly long lines, and therefore it tends to lead to cleaner, easier to read code. So I personally prefer splitting this across 2 lines and using a variable here. Of course, we must use a variable if
gang, motherfucker, gang.
If we ever want to use this anchor element again anywhere else in our code, then we should always store it in a variable. Otherwise, if we would want to use it again later in other parts of our code, we would have to refetch it. We would have to rerun this getElementById command. So if that's our plan, storing it in a variable and only running this command once will be a bit more efficient. Either way, we are operating on that element that is returned by getElementById. And since we know that this is an anchor element, we can access the href property, as we did it up here, and assign our new value, as we did it up here. So just assign a new value. And that's simply a quicker and more secure way of getting access to a specific element by its ID. This is how we can search for a certain element in our DOM, in our HTML code, so to say, and then do something with it.